Hello and welcome to the first recorded lecture for Phil 137. So this first piece I chose, it's definitely an opinionated piece, and it presents what is a kind of a consensus that's starting to develop in moral psychology and in psychology. Um, but we will see articles that push against some of these various claims. Um, but the theme of this course is kind of around sort of this general consensus that seems to be building up. So this is exemplified by Jonathan Haidt. So this is what he calls this, the new synthesis in moral psychology. So psychology, economics, anthropology, there's a lot of sciences that seek to explain human behavior in some way. Um, and if you're trying to explain human behavior, you could do worse than to assume that humans are self-interested. Meaning that, right, we have desires for various things, basic desires for food and sex, power, you name it, right? And given that desire, right, we're going to engage in behaviors that will satisfy those desires. Um, and that certainly is the case on some level, but it can't be the whole story. For example, look at this next slide for a moment and try to complete the question here. And certainly pause this and take your time doing the entire thing if you like. But you notice there's two columns, right? So column A, in each column you're asked to put how much money it would take you to get you to do some. So column A says how much would I have to pay you for you to stick a pin into your palm, whatever amount that would be. Next column says, okay, how much would I have to pay you to get you to stick a pin in the palm of a child you don't know, right? And fill in the amount there. So fill through that whole thing, right? And you may notice a trend, right? So column A asks you certain things, right, that have a moral valence. But then column B uh, talks about some things that involve other people. Right? So if you've done, right, that whole little quiz and you've added up the columns, and if your total for column B is greater than your total for column A, you could say you're not just a homo economicus, right, just a totally self-interested being, you're a homo moralis, right? Your behavior is best explained by, to some degree, having moral motivations, not just pure self-interest. Moral psychology, science that attempts to explain that, right? Where does moral behavior come from? How does it operate in our minds? So why does he call this a synthesis? Well, moral psychology is inherently an interdisciplinary project. Um, it's been around for a long time, so there were earlier attempts at uh, psychology. They tried to sort of fuse behaviorist psychology with developmental psychology that was pioneered by Kohlberg, and then neurobiology, which at the time they thought activity in the hypothalamus was super important for morality. And they thought, yeah, getting all these together, we're going to solve this problem of right what morality is and how it works in our brains. Well, that attempt failed, right? Behaviorism is uh, pretty much dead in psychology, although we use a lot of their methods. Um, Kohlberg's work is now passe. We certainly don't think the hypothalamus is the center of morality. General interdisciplinary approach is still alive. So we're still trying to combine experimental psychology, philosophical ethics, and neuroscience to figure out the theory of moral behavior. So that's why it's a synthesis. So Haidt thinks that we're starting to get an answer here, right? We're moving into the direction of an adequate theory of moral psychology. And he thinks there's four basic principles that we have derived from research uh, that he thinks will sort of form at least part of the basis, right, of this adequate theory of moral psychology. And the principles are the way he states them are a little, well, each one will get explained a little bit, and really throughout the course, right? Maybe not adequately in this lecture, but at least we'll get. So, principles are number one, intuitive primacy, not dictatorship. That probably means nothing to you right now. We'll talk much more about it. Two, moral thinking is for social doing. Three, morality binds and builds. or morality is more about harm than it is about fairness. So we'll go through each of these in a little more detail. Principle one, intuitive primacy. Well, our behavior is governed in at least two ways, right? So sometimes our actions come from rational deliberation, right? So maybe I've decided that I'm going to donate a certain percentage of my income to charity because I think it's the moral thing to do. And then I might go through and research different charities, decide which one, does the most good for my money, right? And then I might come to a decision about donate to. That's one way, right, that we make decisions, and that's one way that our actions are governed, but it's not the only way, right? So there are other examples of moral behavior where, I just step into oncoming traffic and grab somebody, right? This is still from a video of someone saving a child, throwing themselves in front of a car, right, to save a child. That's another way we make decisions with a moral valence. Very different, right, than the careful, deliberative decision to what to donate money to. So the question is, which one is more important? Is one of them more important, right? These are often divided into what's called system one and system two. System one being the more intuitive, right, instinctive sort of decision making, and system two being the more slower, sort of deliberate. Um, is intuition or reasoning the more fundamental one? Is one more fundamental than the other? Well, the claim here, Haidt's claim here, is that the intuitive, uh, right, acting with your gut version is the more fundamental for moral reasoning. Um, so more about intuitive processes. Intuitive processes are these system one processes they're fast, they're often automatic, they don't require a lot of deliberation or thinking. They can be unconscious frequently, right? You don't even at any conscious level recall making the decision, right? You just jump in front of the car. They're usually affect laden, right? So by affect, we typically mean emotion or other similar kinds of feelings that have like a positive or negative valence to them, right? Um, by contrast, right, reasoning, the system two thinking is slow, deliberate, typically conscious, and usually not heavily affect, not involving a lot of emotion. So the idea of the questionnaire, right, that you read, right? So how much would I have to pay you to stick a pin in your own hand? How much would I have to pay you to stick a pin in a child's hand? Here's a child that apparently has fun sticking pins in their hands. Kind of gives me the creeps. Um, but yeah, the idea is when you read that, right, question and you on some level imagine sticking a pin in a child's hand and it gives you an automatic negative emotional reaction, an ick. Um, you didn't have to think through, right, the consequences. Well, how much good would be produced by sticking a pin in a child's hand? How much bad would be produced? I'll have them up, right, like I did with deciding how to donate my money to charity. I didn't have to ask myself, well, what would the Bible say, or what are some abstract moral principle? What would Kant say, right? Um, no, you just kind of get the instant feeling. You say, no, I don't want to do that. You have to pay me a lot more to make me do that. So Haidt's claim is like before most sort of moral judgments that you might make, even if there's any sort of rational calculation, there's going to first be a sort of intuitive feeling that goes along with it. It's obviously happens a lot faster than the rational thinking, so it's going to come first. So at least temporally, right, it does have primacy. Um, and he thinks sort of it has primacy in a few more ways. So here he lists sort of a bunch of studies that give evidence for this primacy of intuition. Often in this course, I will just sort of, um, in very simple terms, sort of say what the result of the study is. I often don't get into the details. We will cover one or two studies in more detail. We'll read the actual that has all the methods and in it. Um, but typically, I'll talk about these studies that are relatively high level. But you may want to follow the citations. Interesting. You may want to challenge some of these claims in your paper. But anyways, so some of these results include that intuitive reactions tend to happen before rational judgment, as we just described. It also seems that the final judgments statistically tend to reflect the initial intuitive reaction, right? So whatever our gut says tends to be what we go with in the end. It also seems that if you manipulate people's emotions, it will change their moral judgments. Right? You can do that in a number of ways. Um, Sometimes you can have an intuition without. Sometimes something feels wrong and you just can't say why, right? And we'll see examples of that later on in the course. I know it's wrong. I can't give you a reason, right? But my gut tells me it's wrong. And number five, people typically form a judgment early on, and we find what happens experimentally is they will use reasoning, but only to confirm their initial judgment. People rarely use their reasoning to try to refute their own initial judgments. So you add all those up, and you get that intuitions drive a lot of our moral judgment. Some of this research or the theoretical background comes from Antonio Damasio. He's argued extensively that emotions play an important role in decision making in general, not just moral decision making. And he's used evidence from subjects that have damage to certain part of the brain, prefrontal cortex, right? Um, People with that sort of brain damage have normal intelligence, but they'll have certain serious deficits in emotion. And it turns out that people with normal intelligence and rational capabilities, if they don't have the emotional, actually find it hard to make decisions. Calculate, right? But they never get that emotional push that just makes them act, right? So again, more support for the intuitive emotional reactions are a primary in not just moral decision making, but decision making more generally. Other evidence has come from Josh Greene. We'll actually read this study later in the course. Um, so he put people in an MRI machine and watched their brain activity while they answered questions about some fairly complicated moral dilemmas. So MRI machines, they basically measure blood flow, right? And they tell you which part of your brain is active at any time, right? Because your brain means you're using that part of the brain. So Greene would give people questions that were kind of difficult. Would you smother a baby to death if it was crying and would give away your location to enemy soldiers who would then kill everybody, right? Including the baby. So that sounds terrible. You don't want to smother a baby to death. But you think, well, the baby would die anyways, right? So at least saved. And usually people eventually will say, yeah, I guess I would have to smother the baby, right? You can watch in people's brains as they go through the whole process, um, and you'll see the initial intuitive revulsion to the idea of hurting the baby, which we know is associated with activity in certain parts of the brain, and then we'll see other parts of the brain conflict, and then activity in the brain processing, right? And the brain there, you don't have to know like all the parts of the brain. I don't even really know all of them. I'm a philosophy of mind guy, but it's mostly like cognitive psychology, right? So I know the brain at a course level, but I always don't worry if you're not. Okay, so we're still on right this point number one of his four, right? Um, Intuitions seem to have primacy, right? But they don't always rule. And the Josh Green example shows this, right? They faculties to come to the decision that, yeah, they would smother the baby, which was counter to their initial intuitions. There's a number of ways that we can override our initial intuitions. Use conscious verbal reasoning to weigh out the costs and benefits of an action. That's probably what subject were doing, right? They're saying, oh, well, the baby would die anyway, and also all these people would die, so more lives, blah, blah, blah. Another way to sort of change your mind and get around the primacy of intuition, reframe the question, right? And that can sometimes flash new flash of intuition that's different than the first and drives your moral reasoning in a different direction. So, if you frame it as like lives instead of smothering babies or whatever, right? That can help. Number three, we can talk to other people, right? And they might give us new reasons, will trigger, again, new flashes of intuition. Anytime you can get, right, your gut to move, you can possibly move in a different direction. Number three is maybe the most common, right? Because if you'll recall from an earlier slide, there's evidence that we rarely seek out information that would refute our initial judgment, right? But other people will, right? Other people will gladly try to refute you. So that's a reliable way to change your mind, right? So um, also, I mean, ultimately, it does seem like number one would have to be the final judge, right? So even if you use reframing or other people's new intuitions, in the end, it does go through the slower rational process as well, right? Okay, on to principle two, right? So moral thinking is for social doing. So humans are not did not evolve to be reasoning machines, right? Our brains evolved to help our bodies act in more useful and clever ways. So that must be the case, right? Sort of as soon as he states this principle, immediately begins to undermine it and point out ways in which our brains are actually deceive us, right? So we tend to be bad at the reasons for our own actions, right? Um, we tend to confabulate stories that seem plausible or put us in a favorable light. Actually, always have perfect insight into why we do what we do. Um, be worse at predicting our own moral behavior than we are at predicting the behavior of others, right? So you say, "Oh yeah, I would do the right thing in this situation." Turns out, no, you wouldn't. But we're a little bit more objective about other people. Um, so it seems like a lot of what our brains are doing, or at least the system two part, our behavior after the fact. That rational functioning is not much before the action. A lot of it is the intuitive, right? So a lot of his principle two is um, and even when we're dealing with others, it does seem that reason will follow intuition. So, for example, Haidt, these researchers, they hypnotize subjects to feel disgust when some neutral keyword, like whatever shoe or blanket, right? Um, that word comes up, and all of a sudden their training, their hypnosis training, they just feel an emotion of disgust, right? Well, people who were hypnotized in that way would tend to judge other people more harshly if they mentioned the word blanket, right, which triggered that. So again, it was the feeling, it was the emotion that was guiding their moral judgment. They had no objective reason to judge that person. Invented reasons to dislike the other person, right? When the story might be completely morally neutral, and it's these people are reading scenarios, right, and it has to judge the person, right? So the scenario might even be totally morally neutral, but if they heard the trigger word blanket, right, I don't like this person. This person is immoral, right? So it's again emotionally driven. Principle three, morality binds and builds. So one natural place to look for the evolution of moral behavior. Again, the question is like, um, certainly humans are self-interested, right? But where did this extra thing come from? We actually sometimes care about other people, even to our, um, even against our own interests, right? One place to look for that is in relations. It is evolutionarily advantageous to us to lead towards our children and our relatives and things like that. Um, and there can be some advantage in reciprocal altruism. So we can do favors for others if we know they will do us favors back. So those certainly probably play some role in the development of morality. Um, but there's also a fair amount of altruism to total strangers, right? Our relatives that can't do us a favor back, and yet we do often with kindness and morally towards others. Um, so one, the Durkheim, humans, right, we're social creatures and our social groups get larger and larger. The community in a group of that size, um, you need some mechanism beyond just kin relations, right, to maintain order and a good reputation, a good signal, right, that other people can trust you and that you are sort of a part of the group and you can get ahead in that group. You have a good reputation, and you get a good reputation, right, by acting morally and doing kind things, even to strangers, right, is the idea. And there's been game theoretic experiments. We'll cover some of those that support this claim, right? This hypothesis about where morality towards strangers comes from. There's also more support for this account, right? Indirect reciprocity, where it's like I'm not doing someone a favor who will directly give me a favor, but I am building a good reputation, right? Which does well for me in a society. This will solve the free rider problem, right, which always will arise in sort of any large cooperative project. Free riders are people who take the benefits, right, of society without giving. You have a general rule is like be benevolent towards others. Somebody could see that and be like, how about I don't be benevolent and everyone will be benevolent towards me and I'll rip them off and I'll get ahead, right? You need to somehow solve that problem of people being able to get ahead by being free riders. Um, and the reputation is one way to signal that, right? You screw over one person, that gets around, all of a sudden, right, no one will deal with you anymore. So groups that solve this free rider problem will prosper, multiply. Again, evolutionarily, that's good, right? It'll preserve your genetics. So, seems likely that that morality, right, evolution aided in morality. Like the larger the group, moral behavior is going to preserve your genes. The development of religion maybe also played a role, right? Because most religions encourage these sorts of values, right? This sort of benevolence. Um, there's also the phenomenon of mirror neurons, which you may or may not have heard of, right? But when we see another person perform an action or make a face, neurons fire in our brains, right, that are associated with those same motor routines, right? And those are thought to facilitate empathy, right? So you see somebody crying, literally like the neurons involved with crying or firing in your brain, right? And you will feel sad. So this is sort of an adaptation that is also social and would go along with this whole idea of right the evolutionary advantage of moral behavior. Okay, and then finally, principle four, morality is more about harm than if you've ever taken just an ethics course in philosophy, you'll have encountered kind of the two main strains of moral theory these days, consequentialism and deontology. Consequentialism is the idea that a bad action is one that causes more harm to people than good. Good action is one that causes more good than harm, right? Or more pain. It's cast out in a number of different ways. The other strain, deontology, is concerned more with rights and justice, right? Um, so a deontologist would say you cannot kill an innocent person, even if it were to have some great benefit, right? There are certain things you just cannot do. It's not all about, right, harm. Um, those two strains of morality probably are in our brains somewhere. They probably reflect two evolved mental mechanisms for moral decisions. The first one probably evolved for detecting harm. It probably children and close kin, right? It's it's something you would want to know if your children are hurt. Um, this idea for fairness probably developed a bit later in larger social groups, right? For example, when you're free riders, right? You want to know who's following the rules, right? Is this person a rule follower? Are they a rule breaker? I don't want to deal with a rule breaker. So Haidt has identified at least three others. He wants to expand the notion, right, and say, and especially if you look outside of our culture to other cultures, there's things about for authority is a large strain in morality in a lot of cultures. Purity is one, loyalty. Um, so he thinks that Principle 4, is part of the current consensus. This uh, emphasis on harm and harm detection is like the main basis of morality. Um, but he actually wants to push back against Principle 4. In the end, Haidt says this new synthesis is not totally synthesized yet, and at the very least, one of these principles I think is wrong. We'll see another article by Haidt where he fleshes that view out. So that's just a little intro to the sort of thing we'll be talking about. We'll talk about a lot of these themes much more in the course, but next time.